This is Kathryn with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned. We are here to bring you information on the most relevant topics regarding disability rights and advocacy. On February 24th, advocates and the DRNY staff attended the New York State Board of Elections accessibility demonstration for the ES&S ExpressVote XL ballot marking device, or BMD. And we're going to talk to two people today about how that demonstration went. Today we have Christy Asbee, PATBI and PAVA Director here at DRNY. And we are also joined by Kathryn Carroll, the Director of Advocacy at the Center for Disability Rights. Hello, both of you. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Kathryn.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's talk a little bit about, Katie, you are not representing Center for Disability Rights here today. You're going to talk about your personal experience at this demonstration. For our audience, can you just let us know, what does the Center for Disability Rights do? And Christy, how are we different? So Katie, we'll start with you.
Sure. So the Center for Disability Rights is one of New York's Centers for Independent Living. The Center for Disability Rights is headquartered in Rochester, but we have several other offices, including one here in Albany, which is where I work on our policy agenda. The Center for Disability Rights advocates for the civil rights, community integration, and independence of people with disabilities. And as a Center for Independent Living, we do that through a number of different services that we offer. We're funded by various grants to assist basically anyone with a disability who wants to, become more integrated into the community.
And Christy, how are we different at DRNY?
Well, we share a lot of the same values and intentions in our work. However, Disability Rights New York predominantly is a law office, and we provide advocacy services in more of that legal front. With one of my teams, the voting access team, that is not a program that has a legal capacity other than providing non-litigation-based advocacy services. We do administrative hearings on occasion, but we would never, through that program, file a law office. Our grant funding doesn't allow it. But the CDR and DRNY definitely work collaboratively together, and we are great partners.
And as we talked about, it'll be great to do a follow-up podcast to hear more about the Center for Disability Rights at a different time. So today we're going to talk about this follow-up demonstration that was held on February 24th, really look at the accessibility of this new BMD ES&S ExpressVote XL. And so this was the second demonstration. The first one, Christy, there were a bunch of concerns. Can you talk to us about what those concerns were?
Yeah, at the first demonstration, that was the mandated public demonstration. That was on January 14th of 2020. We went, there were lots of other advocates there as well. The room certainly was small. We were in tight quarters, and the intention of that demonstration was not to use the device. It was to watch the ES&S representative and the Board of Elections staff show us the device. And we just didn't have time after all the questions and the answers to get our hands on the device and actually test it out. At that January 14th demonstration, we noticed some accessibility concerns. So there were some concerns about the audio readback feature. So when you have an accessible session going on, you can engage the audio readback so that the machine provides audio output for the voter who needs to have that accommodation in order to vote independently and privately. So one of the main concerns that we had, and we identified it very early on, is that the audio readback wouldn't identify the party that the candidate in the contest was with. So that is concerning, as well as the audio readback for write-in candidates at that last stage of the voting process where it's called verifying your ballot. So where you're checking to see if your ballot has all of the candidates selected that you want. So when you input a write-in at the verification stage, it simply identifies write-in. Other concerns were we weren't sure if the touch screen was accessible for people with disabilities, predominantly physical disabilities that might require a longer touch or a shorter touch. those are the concerns that we had, among other concerns, but we don't have to get into those today. Again, if you want to listen to the concerns, go back to our previous podcast on the issue.
And Katie, were you there at the first demonstration?
So I actually didn't make it to the January demonstration, so I was extra pleased that I was able to make it to the second one.
So after that January 14th demonstration, we reached out to the Board of Elections, and Christy, you requested another demonstration, a hands-on accessibility specific demonstration. How did the Board of Elections respond to that?
My work with the State Board of Elections is very positive. They respond to many of our requests, and we have had good collaborative experiences with the State Board of Elections. I was not surprised that they were actually eager to host this because the State Board of Elections is required to ensure that voting programs are accessible. This is a great way to demonstrate to the commissioners who are voting on certifying this device or not to identify any issues that may be seen down the line. They certainly don't want to certify devices that aren't accessible.
Right. And I was able to be at the first demonstration, and I would say that there were a lot of questions that you posed to them, and there were a lot of great answers. And I think given the short turnaround for this second demonstration really spoke to their willingness to participate in this process a little more fully. So, Katie, can you talk to us about when you arrived for the second demonstration? Did you have certain expectations, or did you have any concerns before you got there that you wanted to make sure they were being addressed?
So before arriving at the demonstration, I had a few thoughts. I was aware of the work that DRNY was already doing to assess these ES&S devices for accessibility. So I knew that there were some specific concerns. So I was curious to see if those were in the process of being resolved. For me personally, I have, up until now, my personal experience with voting has been, if not using absentee ballots, using BMDs that are meant to be just used by people with disabilities and not devices like the ExpressVote XL, which are basically the same machine, but can function as an accessible ballot marking device.
And so were you able to actually have a hands-on moment with this new machine?
I did. My first impression of the machine was that, wow, it has a big screen. And I'll just back up and say, so I am a disabled person, and one of my disabilities is that I have low vision. I have some usable vision, but for me, the audio output functions of devices like these are especially helpful. So in approaching the machine, I was like, wow, I can get right up close to the screen. It's pretty big. I was able, using my usable vision, I was able to see what was on the screen, and it was nice to have the opportunity to just pull up a chair and sit up right in front of the machine. I did use the audio output features to work through a ballot and pick candidates in different contests. For those folks out there who haven't experienced this, the ballot was a kind of elongated card with a corner snipped off. And for blind people, you know that that's one way of knowing how to orient a paper. So you could use that to know how to insert the ballot into the machine before picking your candidate. So I did that. There's Braille on the machine. And then there's a control pad that you use if you're using the audio output with various buttons with Braille on them to make selections and do things that you wouldn't be able to do as a blind person in a touchscreen. So I was able to make selections, and Chris mentioned two concerns initially having to do with the audio output of the party of the candidate. So I did notice that the party was announced. I did enter a write-in. I selected myself for an office. And I actually forgot to see if there was audio output of the write-in candidate. So I neglected to do that. But overall, it was a very positive experience. I was able to go through the ballot fairly easily using the audio. And I checked out some of the visual features as well.
That's great. So, Christy, we talked a little bit about some other issues that we were looking at specifically on the 24th. One of the things that we were looking at for the audio accessibility was whether or not all of the information was being read back. was that something that, as Katie has said, it seemed like everything was coming through, that you were getting all the information? Was that the experience overall?
Yeah, except there still exists an issue where when you do a write-in, like what Katie described when you put in a write-in in a contest, when you're at that verification stage, so the very last stage before you hit submit, in that contest, the audio will identify that you have made a write-in selection, and it does not identify the letters that you've inputted. So right now, that's the only accessibility feature that is not embedded in the machine. Now, it's my understanding after having conversations with ES&S reps there at the February 24th demonstration that ES&S is actively working to embed that software upgrade into the device. And that won't come for some time now. It's apparently a computer process that I'm not really that familiar with, but some listeners out there might be. But they are aware of the issue, and it's my understanding that they're actively trying to resolve it.
And so on the topic of software, one of the issues that we talked about in January is that there was information given that this new BMD was running off of Windows 7. And as we all know, this is becoming obsolete. So there would be no service provided for that. Can you speak to that conversation and what the vendor had talked about in reference to Windows 7?
Yeah, so the vendor identified the issue that some of the program that is required to run the ExpressVote XL does operate on Windows 7. They explained it to me that it's really on the back end and the BOE level, the Board of Elections level, and it's software that the counties use. The device itself, they confirmed to me that it's not running on a Windows 7 platform. I don't have any documentation to support that, but if we consider what they say on the face of it, it sounds like Windows 7 is not actually on the device that voters are going to use.
And so, Katie, there's another issue at hand, and that is around whether or not this machine can be used both as a BMD and for someone who does not need a BMD. And if a polling place were to use it just as a BMD, then there would be a difference in the way that people were voting. So then anonymity becomes an issue. Then people who are using the BMD, you would be able to know who they were based on the ballot that they were using, because it would be different than a paper ballot. What are your thoughts on that as far as someone who has used a BMD and who would be using a BMD to know that your voting would be different in that way and able to be identified as different in that way?
So that's a really great question. Thanks for asking it. As I mentioned before, my voting experience so far has been with a BMD. So my ballot has looked different from other ballots that were cast in the same polling place as me. And I know that this is something that's on people's minds right now with the integrity of elections being questioned and people wondering whether machines can be hacked. And I know that in some places there's a movement to bring back the paper ballot, even where polling places were using machines. And I do feel, as a disabled person who relies on an accessible way of voting, that I'm uncomfortable with the idea that my ballot looks different and can be identified, separate from, all the other ballots that are out there. And I would personally urge, the powers that be to implement policies to ensure that the vote of a disabled person is truly a private vote. And by private, I mean, your vote just looks like everybody else's.
Christy, can you speak to the legality of that issue?
Right. So under state and federal law, every voter is entitled to a private and independent vote. The existence of the Help America Vote Act really helped push that movement because that mandated that everyone has access to a ballot marking device, which is what the ExpressVote XL would be if it were placed in your polling location. The ADA and also state law protect an individual who has a disability, their right to a private and independent vote. It requires accommodations be made so that people can get to the polling places and have access to assistive technology that will help them vote in the same way that their non-disabled peer voters can vote and how they vote. So while the issue is not necessarily heavily litigated, the ADA is very clear in what it requires, and state law is also very clear on the issue. So if a polling location limits the use of, in particular, the ExpressVote XL and the printing of these barcode ballots, which look different, as Katie explained, they look like receipts, essentially, versus a traditional ballot, which most people are familiar with how that looks. If there's a limit to who's accessing the ExpressVote XL, then it would be a problem. And I think that there would be legal challenges there if their ballot could be identified
as different than other ballots out there.
Right, exactly.
Well, we've really looked at all of the issues, I think, that you were hoping for when we had the first demonstration in January. After you came back from that second demonstration, you felt like a lot of those issues were addressed. Can you speak to that, Christy?
Yeah, I think overall our concerns were addressed. And even though that issue with the write-in candidate and the validation, ES&S has provided information that they are actively working on a solution. And that at this point is about all that we can do in terms of ensuring that the device itself is accessible and that progress is made where it lacks the accessible features. So certainly we are, as an organization, and the PAVA team, we're not going to oppose this certification.
And Katie, after your experience, is there anything else that you would like to, whether it's this vendor, ES&S, or any other BMD vendors, are there any other concerns that you had that you thought, you know what, if they did this, this would make it a lot more accessible and this would be better for maybe me or someone else to use? Did you have any feedback for them?
So I did. A few of the things that I shared with the ES&S folks were that I appreciated the responsiveness of the device. I think in using the audio output, it can be a little unnerving. You don't know whether, the button that you pressed registered until it starts speaking again. And I found the device fairly responsive. I told them that, including the control panel. As I mentioned, I do have some usable vision, so I mentioned to them some thoughts I had about the display and the way that things were shown there, including the contrast. Contrast is huge. I believe they had a combination of white and blue and white and green, which generally are pretty good contrast, but I did mention that to them. And specifically also the use of all caps text, which can be kind of difficult to read visually when all of the letters are the same height. So I said, you might want to consider changing that. And fortunately, they did say that those were programming things that they could address fairly quickly.
That's great. And it sounds like they were able to answer your questions on the spot.
Right.
So, Christy, I want to make one point clear that this BMD is not yet in any counties, correct?
Right, because it hasn't been certified by New York State as of today.
And so what would you like county boards of election to know about this particular machine?
So over the two demonstrations that we participated in, what I learned was that this device is quite customizable. I don't know to what extent it is customizable, but because of the vast differences from the public demonstration and the accessibility demonstration, I learned that this device has a lot of features, and boards of elections need to know what features are embedded into the device and use them wisely and in the way that will be most accommodating to voters. So it's crucial to ask questions. If you are a county board of elections commissioner, work with the vendors of whatever machine you have, whether it's the ExpressVote XL, if this device is certified, or if the the county elects to purchase the new Dominion device that was recently certified. It's just really important because these devices are higher tech than what we have currently, than what most boards of elections are going to be replacing. So learning what features can be embedded is crucial to making sure that all voters with or without disabilities are able to vote in the most effective way possible.
That's really good information. And as we all know, education, whether it's about the machine or your voting rights or what you can and can't expect on voting day, if you can get the education out there, it's better for everybody. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up this podcast?
Yeah, I want to urge other disabled people out there to ask questions and take the time to learn about the voting machines in their county, because every county is different, right? And it's important to know what you're going to encounter on election day. It doesn't help to be stressed out or unfamiliar with the machine. So I encourage people to just take a few minutes, go online, figure out what machine is in their area and how it might be accessible to them, because your vote does matter. And I do think I would appreciate the work of DRNY in any event, but I think especially now, with so much going on in terms of threats to so many other areas of disability rights, challenges to access to health care and Medicaid and public accommodations and things like that, threats to the ADA, I think even now more than ever, people need to vote, and your vote does matter.
Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. If there is a subject you would like us to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org or comment below. Tune in next Wednesday, where we'll bring you more information on disability rights in the state of New York. The closed caption version of this podcast is available on our YouTube channel. To listen to more Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned, follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.